But at any rate, we're delighted that some people actually showed up, and we know that other folks are going to be watching us on television.
It's an absolutely appalling day. Wind 30, 40, 50 miles per hour, no travel advised, streets slippery and snowy.
Yep.
It's a North Dakota winter day.
It is a North Dakota winter day. I spent the last week in the Red River Valley, and I know we're having a rough North Dakota winter when the people in Fargo and Grand Forks are complaining about the winter. And I told them, well, I'm from southwestern North Dakota. I'm originally from Hettinger, and we always thought we were sort of in the banana belt, and we kind of figured that this kind of winter we're having this year is what the Red River Valley always had. But they assured me that that is not true, that this has really been a very, very brutal winter for them as well. So we're delighted. You know, there's so much that goes into getting the taping done and all the technology that's involved in this that it's just very difficult to cancel it. So we thought we would go ahead and do it anyway, and we get the taping, and it gets put out there on all the cable access television stations. Dakota Media Access right here in our local area and other access stations around the state. And so we thought we'd go ahead and do it anyway. And so those of you that showed up today, we're delighted that you're here. And I certainly, I guess I should start off by introducing myself. I just took off talking. I'm Larry Scogan. I'm the interim chancellor for the North Dakota University System. And my good friend Clay Jenkinson and I, we've been doing this about 6 years now. It's unbelievable how fast it has gone.
This is the smallest audience ever.
This is the smallest audience. But I certainly want to express my appreciation to Bismarck State College and to President Dave Clark, who himself showed up today. We appreciate you being here, Dave, because, you know, I'm no longer associated with Bismarck State, and so I'm delighted that
That's not really true. You're no longer the president of Bismarck State. You're the chancellor of higher education. You're associated with this institution.
Thanks for the interruption, Clay.
Yeah.
So what I was going to say is that that I appreciate very much that Bismarck State continues to support these conversations that we do. They really are. They're a lot of fun. So at any rate, I will say to those that are watching us on television that I really appreciate the support that we're getting in the television audience. As I just said,
you on the street.
I just came back from the Red River Valley. I was at meetings where individuals came up to me and said, you know, we watch you and what's his name? They said, we watch you.
I get that same conversation, by the way.
They said, we watch you and Clay Jenkinson, and we really enjoy the conversation. So we're delighted that we can do something that participates in the kinds of conversations of historic and humanist value that we've been doing, and we're delighted that people will show up and that folks are watching us on TV as well.
And, you know, Larry, the next one in this series will be on Sunday, March 30th. About the time that spring really begins, and it's on Shakespeare's Hamlet, which I know you're going to look forward to.
I am, very much.
And we should watch a couple of versions of it together before
talk. We were talking earlier, we're going to do Pizza and Hamlet here a couple times here, so we can really get ready for it.
So that's the next
I'm
one
looking forward to that.
And then the final one of the series for this year is on Crazy Horse. It's on May 4th, Sunday, May 4th, 2014, The Life and Death of Crazy Horse, a subject of great interest to both of us. You actually wrote your book on Indian depredation claims, and so you are a historian by training who's an expert in that era of the history of the American West, right?
Well, yes. I don't know if I'd call myself an expert, but I like to think I'm a scholar that dabbles in that area, of course, and I look forward to having that conversation. Crazy Horse is a very misunderstood individual, but a very prominent Native American, and died in really terrible circumstances in Fort Robinson.
September 1876, not so long after, 77, not so long after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. But you and I have been to Sitting Bull's grave, which is in South Dakota. But no one can go to Crazy Horse's grave because no one is certain where he's buried.
Yeah, we'll talk a lot more about that on that last conversation, but you know, it always interests me when you look in history books and they've got a picture of some Indian and it'll say Crazy Horse. Well, there's no photograph of Crazy Horse.
There's no known photograph of Crazy
Horse. He refused to have his picture taken. And he was buried after he was killed by the Army at Fort Robinson. His parents actually put him on a wagon, and they took off, and they buried him someplace that no one knows. So.
But somewhere near Chadron, Fort Robinson, somewhere within about a day's
Yep.
journey.
So we're going to talk a lot about that.
So this is the 2 remaining talks.
Yep. So let's
go back to Leonardo da Vinci.
go ahead.
Well,
Just introduce
people have been asking, what does this have to do? Typically, our conversations are about the Great Plains, about American history, about the West, about North Dakota. This, of course, is something of a stretch for us, right?
Well, I've had so many people come up to me, they hear what this program's going to be, and they go, Jackie Kennedy and Mona Lisa? What's the connection? And it's amazing when you know what the connection is, that it was actually a worldwide event. It was of great interest to the whole globe what was going on relative to Jackie Kennedy and Mona Lisa. And so very quickly, and then this is what we're going to talk about today, but just so everybody knows, and Clay, jump in anytime you want, but the bottom line to it is that Jackie Kennedy, probably the only person that could pull this off, actually got the French government to donate the Mona Lisa for 12 weeks on a tour of the United States. Spent 6 weeks in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery, and spent 6 weeks at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. And 2 million Americans walked by the Mona Lisa. And so that's the connection between Jackie Kennedy and Mona Lisa, and we're going to talk a lot more about that.
So what happened was that John Kennedy was elected in 1960, and this came out of our big symposium on John F. Kennedy that we had here on the campus of Bismarck State, co-sponsored by the Historical Society, the Dakota Institute, and Bismarck State in November. And when we began looking at this, I did not know the story. I don't know if you did, that the Mona Lisa had come here during our lifetime, but I did not know it. John Kennedy went to Vienna in May of 1961 for a summit meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. And it was his first real test as an international statesman. And Khrushchev thought that Kennedy was a lightweight and just a child, and he bullied him at that summit. And Kennedy said he treated me like a little child, and he'd never felt so bullied in his life. And it really set the Kennedy administration off on the wrong footing during a critical period during the Cold War. But before Kennedy went to Vienna, he stopped in Paris to see Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle was, of course, the hero of World War II and the great leader of France, and not very friendly to the United States or to American geopolitical interests. And he, too, regarded John Kennedy as a child and a lightweight. But Kennedy had a secret charm in his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, who spoke flawless French. I mean, flawless French. She was deeply immersed in European continental culture, including French culture. And she dressed as well as any first lady has ever dressed, often with European designs. And she so charmed de Gaulle and the French that they sort of fell in love with the Kennedys. And while they were there, they met André Malraux, who was a novelist and he had been in the resistance during the war, and he was this very romantic and colorful cultural attaché of France. And she began to talk about cultural exchange. And that's what led the French, in an unprecedented moment, for the first time in the history of the painting, to allow the Mona Lisa voluntarily to leave the Louvre and go somewhere else, and it was to the United States of America. So that's the story.
Yep. So I think we ought to get into it. We've got Da Vinci. Where
so here's
start,
this picture.
It's not enough.
Well, before you're done, you're going to see 100 parody pictures of the Mona Lisa. It's the most parodied of all works of art, more than the Scream, more than the Starry Night by Van Gogh. It's the single most parodied piece of art in the history of art. And of course,
and to have Jackie Kennedy's face on it here, if you didn't
makes
recognize
perfect sense,
that,
of course.
makes perfect
Here it is,
sense. Okay.
and you see on the flanking walls here, Dusty Anderson, our terrific IT guy, will keep those up throughout because we'll be coming back and forth to it. So here's the funny part about this, Larry. Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci, is many things. He's sort of the epitome in Western civilization of the universal genius. Scientist, architect, painter, musician, conversationalist, dissector of corpses, military engineer, man of letters, et cetera, et cetera. But he wasn't particularly a painter. He had two real problems as a painter. One was that he procrastinated and virtually never finished anything. Most of his work, there are about 20 Da Vinci paintings that are extant. There's a lot of controversy around the edges, some attributed to him, we're not quite sure, but let's say there are 20 established Da Vinci paintings, which is not a great output compared to, say, Raphael or Michelangelo or Titian. 20 paintings, and at least half of them were never finished. That's problem number one. Problem number two for Da Vinci is that he was an experimenter with materials, and instead of just using the established painting materials of his time, he was constantly trying to invent something new, and it damaged his work. And so the most famous case of that is The Last Supper in Milan, which even in his own lifetime was beginning to fade and crumble because he used a highly imperfect chemistry for the paints. And so here's Da Vinci, who, okay, he's a universal genius, and he sort of is, if you want to name what a genius is, you call him Einstein, Da Vinci, a handful of people, maybe Thomas Jefferson, but just a handful of people in history. But Da Vinci is not particularly a painter. However, as you know, the two most famous paintings in the world are by Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. The Mona Lisa is the most copied portrait in the world, and the Last Supper is not only the most copied religious painting in the world, but it's also the most influential religious painting in the history of art. And so here's this guy who is in a certain sense, he's a very imperfect painter, and he nevertheless painted the two most significant and influential and popular and widely reproduced paintings ever. And then there's a third, isn't there? Because here's the Last Supper. It's been retouched many times. This is the most recent version of it. We'll come back to it. But here is his Vitruvian Man, which is from the famous notebooks. He was fascinated by geometry and mathematics, and he was trying to prove that the human body of a lean, athletic person is perfectly proportioned. And so this is known as Vitruvian Man, and it is also one of the most heavily reproduced of all pieces of art. So think of that. You think of Raphael or Michelangelo or Picasso or Van Gogh or Salvador Dali or Whistler. They're all, in a certain sense, more accomplished painters than Da Vinci because their works are known and they were chemically correct and they finished what they started. Mm-hmm. But it's Da Vinci's three pieces that are the most famous in the world. What do you make of that?
Well, I just want to respond to one of the things that you said in there, just to take exception to, I guess, a bit, is you said he was a man of letters, and he himself said he was not a man of letters because he had no formal education.
He's not a well-educated
man. Yeah. And so, and I think that's important, and you know, I find that important in understanding genius as a college administrator. Is, you know, because you take a look at, in history, at guys like Steve Jobs, for example, that sort of dropped out of college before he even got started, and yet he picked up what he wanted to know. And it appears that Da Vinci did the same thing. He just sort of studied what he wanted to study and became an expert in what he wanted to study. But the reality is that his only formal kind of training was in painting, where he worked in the workshop in Florence.
He was an apprentice.
And he was an apprentice, and his father figured that he had no future. and so he took some sketches that Leonardo had done to a workshop, Verrocchio, I think it is, and took it to his workshop, and the guy said, hey, he's got some talent here. And so he brought him into the workshop where they sort of mass-produced paintings, and he was part of that. And that was the only formal kind of education that he received.
And as an educator, this interests you, why?
Well, no, it just always interests me that, you know, in fact, I had this very interesting discussion this weekend with some young people out in Fargo, and I said, what's the one thing, I had a great dinner conversation, and I said, what's the one thing I should take away from this conversation? And this one young man said, well, as a school administrator, or as administrators writ large, that universities and colleges have to realize that today they are not the option for education, they're an option. And I thought that's a remarkable thing to say, that that the institutions of higher learning are not the option for learning, they're an option for learning. And so at any rate, so I'm just intrigued then when I read a biography on Leonardo da Vinci that he, once again, is someone that had this sort of genius, but it was never trained in the academy.
Right, but, and I hear you, but just to stop and challenge you for, I mean, the world has produced 11 billion people perhaps, or 9 or 10 billion people in its whole history.
Yep, 7.5 right now.
And 1 out of a billion or 1 out of a couple of billion is a genius.
Yeah.
Out of how many Bill Gates does one produce, or Steve Jobs? You produce 1 now and 1 then. I mean, we can count them on a short list. I wouldn't put either of them in the category of Leonardo da Vinci, but I take your point. But surely your point is stay in school, that unless you're a genius, don't go that route.
No, I think in this world today, and we're really going to, we could get off this, so let's not belabor the point, but the reality is that with knowledge and information at the fingertips of young people today, the question is, what is the role of the academy?
Because, well, I mean, that is a long conversation for another day, but surely you don't think that a smart kid with an internet is enough. Surely, Larry, no.
Well,
we need masters, we need discipline, we need courses, we need learning commons, we need libraries, we need art galleries. We don't just need to be home with our smartphones.
Yeah, no, but I do believe that we've come to an era where we have to realize, and I think that young man was exactly right.
That there's competition
that there's now a cafeteria of learning that young people have access to. And we have to recognize that in higher education.
Yeah, there is a cafeteria, but Bismarck State is a restaurant.
I agree with that one.
No, you have to agree with that.
Okay.
So there he is. This
there we
is
go.
Okay.
Actually, let's stop for just a minute. Let's think about this age, the Renaissance. So this morning I was sitting there thinking about the fact that we were going to be talking about these folks today, and look at the time frame of Leonardo da Vinci.
He's 1452 to 1519, Italy.
So let's think about some of the other greats. Michelangelo.
A little younger than...
Michelangelo is 1472 to 1564. They were contemporaries.
And they had a famous argument.
Yeah, and at one point, Leonardo wanted to go to the Vatican, but there was this young upstart named Michelangelo that was already doing well there, and he couldn't find a position.
And he finished things. Michelangelo finished what he started.
Yep. Raphael, 1483 to 1520.
More prolific than either of them, and both combined.
Yep. Botticelli. Botticelli,
Florence.
1445, 1510. All of these really
this
greats.
Great effervescence of art and architecture and mathematics.
It's occurring at the same time. It's sort of like
literature.
when we talk in American history, when we talk about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams, and we think, how did the United States produce all these great minds at the same time? How did they all come up? Well, Florence, Italy, is producing all these greats at the exact same time. And there's something else going on, I think, in much broader sense in the Western world, because just for the heck of it, I took, Christopher Columbus is 1450 to 1506. You think about Christopher Columbus as a contemporary to these guys. And he's one that says, I really think I can get to Asia, convinces Ferdinand and Isabel, I can really get to Asia by sailing west from Spain, which he could have been right, but of course we know he ended up discovering, sort of a broad term. And then, as I think about thought that comes out of all of that, Martin Luther and the Reformation. Martin Luther is 1483 to 1546. So all of this that's going on.
Sir Thomas More. I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of culture, and we call it the Renaissance. Historians have spent endless time trying to figure out what were the factors that made this happen, and can they be replicated? Why did this suddenly emerge out of the late Middle Ages? Well, there were certain breakthroughs, the discovery of perspective. I mean, perspective in painting, if you go back to this, if you look at this painting, The Last Supper, this is It's a fresco. It was painted on a wall of a dining room of a refectory in Milan. But because of perspective, there's a vanishing point above Christ's head, and 3 dimensions are made to look three-dimensional on a two-dimensional plane. Perspective was actually discovered in the Italian Renaissance. Perspective did not exist in the Middle Ages, and it didn't exist in the ancient world. This idea that you can look at a painting and see depth in it is an actual breakthrough, a discovery, an invention of the Renaissance. So there's one, the compass, the printing press, the overseas voyages made possible by the compass, etc. All these, you were saying earlier, people thinking outside the box, but these are partly the comings together of great talent and money and patronage and community spirit, but it's also the coming together, the breakthroughs that came from certain inventions like the telescope, which allowed Galileo and Copernicus to do what they did, or the printing press, which for the first time allowed the Bible to be widely distributed so that people like Martin Luther and Calvin and Thomas More could read it themselves without a priestly set of intermediaries and make their own conclusions about the message of the Old and the New Testaments.
And not just the Bible, but other great ideas. And they would all all these guys that you just mentioned will end up writing books that those ideas then are exchanged around the Western world. So
we should be expecting a renaissance right now.
Okay.
Because think of it, I mean, literally, I'm not trying to be funny here. When I was going to college, and some of you will remember this, when you were in college, you took an art history course, and one of the things you bought a textbook, which had some nice reproductions of great paintings, but you also tended to buy a gray packet of loose paintings, and they were about 4 by 6 inches, and they were printed, and the professor would order them up, and so your course might have these 20 paintings, and my course might have these 20 paintings, but this was your visual. If you wanted to see Starry Night, you had to go to your book or the encyclopedia at home, where it may or may not be reproduced, and it may or may not be reproduced in color, or this course pack. But today, when I'm working on Da Vinci, as I have been now for weeks, I go to the internet to Google Image, and I can have anything, some of them with such high resolution that you can go down, for example, in The Last Supper, not to digress, but we now know that Da Vinci painted, usually it's bread and wine and water, but for some reason he put eels, sliced eel meat, with orange garnishes on as their meal, which is a very unusual thing. But you can actually go in the internet and get so close to this painting that you can see the eel slices and the orange. You could never have done that in 1990 or 1980 or 1970. So now we're living in this moment where if I said to you, Larry, what exactly were Thomas More's dates? Well, before I finish my sentence, you could find out. And you could then have that transmitted up to the screen and to all of your friends and children and family and so on around the world. So we're living in this age when if the printing press and the compass and the telescope enabled these cultural effervescences, we should be in a period when there's going to be an unbelievable flowering of culture because our tools are more amazing in every sense than those tools that they're talking about. So, I mean, you agree, right?
Absolutely.
So the factors were Florence, which was a commercial city. One of Da Vinci's friends in Milan was the father of accounting, of double-entry bookkeeping. So capitalism, in our sense of the term, is being born in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And then these breakthroughs in how knowledge is transmitted. Well, if ever there was a moment in the history of the world when something was more important than Gutenberg, it's the era we're living in right now. Don't you think that's amazing?
Yeah, well, I was already on that conversation earlier. And
just trying to get you back to it.
Okay, no, go back to the Last Supper. The other thing that comes out of the Renaissance and what Leonardo figured out here, and I hadn't really thought much about this until I sat there looking at this picture for a while, and that is to be able to incorporate movement into a flat picture. And you think about that, this is a moment at which, if I remember correctly, where Jesus says, one of you will betray me.
Right.
And so then and so you can see
They're
that from the
reacting.
hand motions, and
It's-
there's a reaction going on, and it is movement that's happening. And before, paintings did not have that. They were static. But Da Vinci figured out how to incorporate movement into a picture, and you can see it.
And one way that he did that was that he studied anatomy. He dissected at least 30 corpses. This is at a time when this was regarded as very unusual work. You know, sinful maybe, kind of creepy, that no responsible or respectable person would do this sort of thing. But he made friends with grave diggers and with hospitals and the equivalent of nursing homes. And then he would dissect corpses to discover what the musculature of the arm was, to look how the neck, the arteries and the veins in the neck and the tension of the structure of our skeleton and so on worked. And you see it in the drawings from his famous notebooks, which were rediscovered in the 19th century. But behind each of these figures, you know, if you and I were going to paint a Last Supper, we'd just try to paint one, right? But behind each of these figures were months of field work in which he would have somebody leaning over the way these apostles are and try to figure out what the veins on the hand look like. And people who really know this art say that when you get deeper and deeper and deeper into it, you can see the unbelievable mastery of anatomy that he brought and physiology that he brought to his painting. And so he's kind of a scientist as painter.
Yeah.
Michelangelo is much more of a painter as painter. Leonardo regarded himself as accurate in an age before photography.
Mm-hmm. And what Michelangelo could do, for example, in the David, it looks like David is just ready to move.
Right.
And you can see all that. And Da Vinci tried to capture that in painting, that sort of...
Trying to take that same, three-dimensionality, but make it visible in two dimensions.
Yep. Okay.
So can I move on?
Please.
Yeah. So this is the first
parody.
of many parodies of the Mona Lisa that we'll see. This is contemporary of now. So let's just quickly go through a couple of these. This is from the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is the greatest of all editions of Britannica. And this is actually not. This is Donald Sassoon, whose book you have here. One of the books that you recommend is this one, which is Leonardo and the Mona Lisa story. Sassoon has written two. Also, Becoming Mona Lisa is this one that I read. And then the other book that I would recommend is by Margaret Leslie Davis, Mona Lisa in Camelot. So you've got a copy of that too. But here's what Sassoon says about his inability to finish anything. His plans to change the course of the river Arno and to dig a canal between Florence and Pisa were abandoned. His Last Supper began to deteriorate almost as soon as he had finished it because he used oil mixed with tempera instead of the quick-drying fresco. The Battle of Anghiari, the most important work he'd ever been commissioned to produce, was unfinished, and the parts that he did complete deteriorated immediately. So he's a genius, but he didn't see everything through. Then this about this quality of that he's more than just an artist. Nor was he a student of the broad, usual, patent appearances only of the world. Its fugitive, fantastic, unaccustomed appearances attracted him most of all. Strange shapes of hills and rocks, rare plants and animals, unusual faces and figures of men, questionable smiles and expressions, whether beautiful or grotesque, far-fetched objects and curiosities were things he loved to pore over and keep in his memory. And if you just look over at the corner to the Mona Lisa, one of the things that makes it such an amazing painting is what's not Mona Lisa, the background. With the grotesques and the river going out to the sea. There's a bridge down on the ground. There are some jagged rocks in the corner. If you took those out and just put an off-white background, it would be a much different painting. This is what this man, Sidney Colvin, is seeing. Colvin also says, neither did he stop at mere appearances, but having stamped the image of things upon his brain, went on indefatigably to probe their hidden laws and causes. He soon satisfied himself that the artist who was content to reproduce the external aspects of things without searching into the hidden workings of nature behind them was one but half equipped for his calling. That's what you were saying about the Last Supper, that behind the external aspects, there's all this human dynamism going on. Every fresh artistic problem immediately became from a far-reaching scientific problem as well. The laws of light and shade, the laws of perspective, including optics and the physiology of the eye, the laws of human and animal anatomy and muscular movement, those of the growth and structure of plants and the powers and properties of water, all these and much more furnished food for his insatiable spirit. And then finally, about his style, he was loved. He was a charming man. He wasn't a brooding artist the way some are. There was nothing about him, as there was afterwards about Michelangelo, dark-tempered, secret or morose. He was open and genial with all men. This is the best 17th century copy or reproduction, imitation of The Last Supper, and you see some of the vibrancy that was in the original there. He says, Colvin in the Encyclopedia Britannica 11 says, "Yet this mere ghost of a picture, The Last Supper, this evocation, half vanished as it was by a great world genius of a mighty spiritual world event, remained a thing indescribably impressive." And you were saying that before we started today, that you had been reading this morning. Remember what you read about The Last Supper?
No.
That it's, you said
What did I say?
that the historian said that it's the painting that
Oh, it's the
created,
watershed painting of the new era.
right, of
That it defines
modernity.
us. Yes, that it defines who we are.
A painting.
And we were talking about that with perspective and with the movement. And
So let's look at his career just briefly here. You said that he apprenticed
The workshop, yeah.
to Verrocchio, and Verrocchio was a sort of a high second-rank painter of the Florentine Renaissance, and it was common in this era for the painter to paint some of the painting and then have his apprentices do the draperies and the river and the lambs and so on. And Leonardo was apparently allowed to paint this angel, which I've marked here. And there's a story, it may or may not be actually true, Larry, but when Verrocchio saw Leonardo's angel, he hung up his paints and said, "I will never paint again because my apprentice is that much greater a genius than I could ever dream of being," and that was the end of Verrocchio's career. Let's look at a few of Leonardo's paintings. The Adoration of the Magi, early, 1481, never completed. So this is how it looks because he didn't add the coloring. This is just it's called the cartoon, and if he had finished it, he would have added all the colored pigments to it. Here's St. Jerome in the Wilderness, also unfinished. But for Da Vinci, if you look at this one closely, Larry, look at the way his muscles and his bones in his chest and in his skull are. Da Vinci spent literally years on these paintings. He didn't just dash these off. You know, Michelangelo, I saw this the other day, it was so interesting. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling in the time it took for Da Vinci to paint the Mona Lisa. So the Sistine Chapel ceiling is almost as big as this ceiling. And he painted all of it in 4 years. And Da Vinci would be out studying, dissecting a corpse, looking at the skull, trying to get it right. Also a cartoon, unfinished. This is, I've seen this one in the Louvre, Virgin of the Rocks. He did 2 versions of it. Again, remember what Sidney Colvin was saying about the grotesque landscapes and the mystery? There's one version, here's the other, the London version, which is, you can see they're different based on the same drawings, but they're quite different in their feel. This is a copy, unfortunately the original is lost, of the famous mythological scene of Leda and the Swan. This is one of my favorites. I just love this. Lady with an ermine. Aristocratic Florentine woman with a pet ermine. This would be more, you know, when we think of the Mona Lisa, look at the Mona Lisa, she was not an aristocrat. She was the wife of a relatively upper middle class sort of a merchant. She was not a famous beauty. She was not a famous woman. She wasn't an aristocrat. She wasn't a person of great power. Her husband had made some money. They had just had the birth of a son. He commissioned Da Vinci to paint the portrait of his wife to hang in their new house. And so this is what a Renaissance aristocrat looks like. The Mona Lisa is essentially a common woman by comparison. Madonna of the Yard Winder. This is the Christ child is holding a yarn distaff. Adoration of the Magi, unfinished cartoon. The Virgin and Child with St. Anne, extraordinarily beautiful. That one's virtually finished. Sigmund Freud has a whole book on this painting. One of Da Vinci's childhood memories was that he was in his cradle. This is a true memory. He was in his cradle and some sort of a bird, a kite, kind of like a hawk, came over his cradle and fluttered its wings and its feathers on his face. And he was never sure whether that actually happened or whether he dreamed that it happened. But when you ask someone, what are your first childhood memories, for Da Vinci, this bird, this kite, appearing at his cradle and sort of in a menacing way, but it turned out it was kind of a caress, is one of his first two memories as a human being. And Freud sees the outline of a hawk or a kite in the draperies of this painting and has a whole book about what this must mean and so on. I see you're skeptical.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's what Freud said.
That's what Freud said.
This is St. John the Baptist, also unfinished, one of his last paintings. And then to the notebooks, the famous notebooks that were rediscovered in the 19th century. Here's what you see, his intense fascination with the human form, the muscles of a man. But Sassoon, who has two books on this subject, says that we've overemphasized the genius of the drawings, that his inventions, his so-called inventions of the tank and the helicopter and the airplane and a whole range of other things were not as impressive as we think, and that we've taken them out of context, and when you put them back in the context of engineering of the late Middle Ages, they're not as unique as people say, and that we should be a little less enamored of this quality of Da Vinci. But here, look at this. Amazing. Then Da Vinci was a very gentle and decent man. He was not the kind of artist as prima donna. And he would go around Florence and he would see caged birds and he would buy them. So he'd say, you have a shop and you have birds to sell, and he'd say, what do you want for the birds? And you'd give him a price, he'd buy them, and then he'd turn the birds loose because he hated to see birds caged up. But birds fascinated him. He tried to create an airplane that would recreate the wing structure of a bird, which is, as we now know, impossible. Here's his helicopter, or one of them. And look at that, that image of the human heart. Can only have been done by a dissector.
Yeah.
There's again the structure of the back of the neck and skull. Sorry about that. And then more of his drawings and inventions. So anyway, you get the sense of who he was, right?
Yep. Everybody got the sense of who he was? Okay. So now we get to go on to the Mona Lisa.
And, of course, the Kennedys.
And the Kennedys.
So here it is, painted in 4 years between 1503 and 1507. There are a lot of theories about this, that this is not the woman in question, that it's somebody else, maybe it's a self-portrait by Da Vinci, etc. You were going to read the catalog
maybe we
copy.
could, well, we've got this up, and Dusty, hopefully you have this then fixed for the screen for our folks. Let's just read what the catalog said about this.
The catalog at Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery. So John Walker was the director of the National Gallery, and it was his response. He was a friend of Mrs. Kennedy's. It was his responsibility to curate this exhibit and to provide security. And then as it came close, he wrote the catalog copy for the exhibit.
Yeah. And I'll just read part of this, sort of a description of the painting. And so if you look at the painting as I read it to you here. Okay, Mona Lisa is seated. The semicircular wooden chair with arm and rails is just visible. She is shown from below the waist, her arms bent and leaning a little on the left arm of the chair, her bust turned slightly toward the spectator, almost full face. Her hands are crossed, the right hand over the left wrist. Her fingers are long, her face round, her cheeks full. Her dark chestnut hair falls in ripples onto her shoulders and is covered with a dark but transparent veil. And I've got to tell you, all the times I've seen the Mona Lisa until I read this description, I never saw the veil. Can you see the veil?
The hairline, the hairnet across her head. She's wearing a net.
She's wearing a net. And if you look on her, it'd be on her right side, you can see the veil just following along.
Back down over her hair.
Over the hair. Her only faintly reddened lips suggest a smile, the famous Mona Lisa smile, right? She wears a dark green low-cut gown pleated across the front of the bust and embroidered with a tracery of gold threads. She is wearing no jewels. Mona Lisa's head is silhouetted against a landscape seen from a bird's eye view and forming two distinct sections. In the lower section, and as high as the model's neck, there is a reddish-brown landscape with a bridge over a blue stream on the right. And I'll stop for a minute. Can you see the bridge?
I've got a picture of it here. Let me see if I can find it. Getting ahead of ourselves, but there's the bridge.
There have been extensive studies trying to identify the bridge that's over her left shoulder.
I'll go back here.
Okay. And on the left, a winding road that leads the spectator into an imaginary world. In the upper section, the atmosphere shades from olive green to greenish blue, and the mountainous landscape, bristling with rock peaks, disappears into the mist.
That's John Walker, the director of the National Gallery of the United States, January 1963, describing in the catalog what people were seeing.
Yeah.
Malraux, who was the French Minister of Culture, you'll see a little video clip of him here in a minute, said of the Mona Lisa, by transfiguring a profane face, a commoner's face, Leonardo gave to the soul of woman the idealization that ancient Greece had previously given to woman's features. But here's what I find so interesting about this. How many of you have seen the Mona Lisa at some point in your life? So we have about half, Larry. This is Serge Bramley, who has a biography of Da Vinci, which is fascinating. He says this, yet it is not the deterioration of the painting that prevents sophisticates from appreciating the Mona Lisa at its true worth. Above all, the painting suffers from being too famous, from having appeared on too many postcards, chocolate boxes, and cheap tin trays, from having been too insistently pressed upon the public. It is fashionable to disparage it. How can one look on it now with fresh eyes? You know, I've spent the last month trying to look on it with fresh eyes, and I've looked at it in the morning and in the evening, and when I've had a glass of wine, and when I've been working out or whatever it is, like, and tried to look at it. Have you tried to do this? Because it's so iconic that it sort of shuts your eyes in a way. You recognize it, but you don't bother to examine it because you've known it all of your life. You see it virtually every week. There's one, I asked myself when we were starting this, is there an image of the Mona Lisa in Bismarck? Answer, yes. Up at the Starbucks by Best Buy at that Mexican restaurant next door, there's a Mona Lisa holding condiments. But it's so universal, it's so ubiquitous, it's so deep in our cultural inheritance that we can't see it anymore, is his point. And so that makes art experts reduce its importance because they think that it's schlock or that it's overexposed or that you literally can't see it anymore. I thought that was fascinating. And then he says, a Chinese poet of the Sung dynasty, Li Qi remarked that the three most distressing things in the world are to see youth damaged by a poor education, to see good tea wasted by bad handling, and to see a magnificent painting devalued by the uncomprehending stare of the multitude. The Mona Lisa is without question a pinnacle of art, but the unbearable fame it has acquired, often for reasons quite unconnected with its intrinsic qualities, means that one has to overcome one's own resistance in order to perceive its greatness. And I was thinking about this, Larry, because when you read an account, this book that you've been reading is a history of the Mona Lisa in the world, especially in France. And the directors of the Louvre have had this problem because 99% of all people who walk through the doors of the Louvre want to see the Mona Lisa and very little else. And all they really want is to have an immediate track to the Mona Lisa, and once they've seen it, they've sort of done the Louvre, which is appalling if you think about it, given how much great art is in the Louvre. And so the directors of the Louvre are constantly trying to find ways to accommodate that, but also to kind of make people wander through the galleries also and see some of the other incredible works of art that are there. And so the painting is so famous that it's kind of overwhelmed its own merit. So let's just say that we could gather up 10,000 portraits of beautiful women from the Renaissance and put them in a warehouse in San Francisco. And we could use that sort of thing from Men in Black and wipe out everyone's memory so that no one had ever heard of or seen the Mona Lisa. So they're just walking into a warehouse with no cultural presuppositions, no internet, no playing cards, no art history course at college. And they walk by extraordinary Renaissance painting of a woman, number 1, 2, 3, 200, 700, 3,000. When they get to the Mona Lisa, how many of those people would stop and say, that's the best one, that's the most famous painting in the world, that's the work of greatest genius? I don't think they would. I think they would think, not bad, and they would move on maybe to Lady with an Ermine, or there might be 500 paintings, there might be 5,000 paintings that people prefer for whatever reason to the Mona Lisa until they know that it's the Mona Lisa, and then that's it, right?
Yeah. So what gives it so much value then?
Well, in cultural studies now, in cultural studies as part of the postmodernism movement, you're not going to like this any better than Freud, I think. But in the cultural studies discipline now, a cultural studies historian would say, we as a culture have privileged the Mona Lisa. We've decided that it's the world's most important painting. It's arbitrary. It may have something to do with merit, but its connection to actual artistic merit is very tenuous and thin. We've decided that's the painting, just as we've decided the Parthenon is the building, just as we've decided the Notre Dame is the great cathedral, and we've decided that Paradise Lost is the greatest poem. And it's not that they're not great, but there is a cultural privileging after which people just get in line to approve and reapprove this over and over and over again. And a postmodernist would say there's not only no reason to think that the Mona Lisa is the greatest painting in the world, but there's positive reason to despise it because of the cultural cachet that has attached to it. So we don't have to agree with that. But if you and I had those Men in Black things and walked in, I doubt that either one of us would say, let's go back and look at that one again. Do you think so?
I don't know. I really don't.
You don't?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I think we do as a culture, we do assign certain value to things, but I also don't think there's some intrinsic beauty in some things that is recognizable.
Right. Well, the people who defend the Mona Lisa say, and that kind of moving back into Freudian terms here, but the people who defend it say, no, that Leonardo was not just a genius in his capacity to paint, or his capacity to see how the body worked underneath the skin, that he was onto something very, very, very deep, some kind of Jungian deep structure of mystery and beauty and the ineffable and that which humans kind of faintly recognize as magnificent but can't put their fingers on, and that this painting and this painting alone has that. And his painting of the woman with the ermine is a beautiful painting of a beautiful woman, but it doesn't have, somehow he didn't open those doors into the foundations of mystery and art and woman and sexuality and smile and so on. And so that this painting is so great because everyone who sees it can't help but in some inarticulate way recognize this thing that's going on here. Just as when you hear, say Beethoven's Fifth, or when you see the Parthenon, it's not just that it's a very beautiful building, it's somehow that there's something deeper going on that you're unaware of. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking when we're talking about the intrinsic value or quality of Mona Lisa, for example, you and I were in Florence almost 2 years ago now, and there are a lot of Davids in Florence. You walk around and, you know, a lot is probably a misstatement, but there are other Davids, but when you see Michelangelo's David, you know you're looking at really a very good piece of art, as opposed to some of the others that are less of that intrinsic value, don't you think?
Because I agree. When you look at the David, what you're seeing is what's known as verisimilitude. When you look at it, you think a piece of marble was chipped at, and out of it emerged this perfection of the human form of a young man at the height of his strength and virility. And that Michelangelo somehow was able to get the calf muscles and get the way the body turned and the casualness of the sling, and that it's so lifelike that you're amazed that it could have been done at all. And when you look at Donatello's David, it doesn't have any of that verisimilitude. It feels like art in a less authentic sense. And so with Michelangelo, the sense is that he somehow could let come out of that marble a perfect human form. That's not what's said of Da Vinci. And so different types of art have different ways of appealing.
Right.
But we were in Rome and we were in Florence. And in Florence we went to the Uffizi, and there are hundreds and hundreds of world-class paintings. And you just have to brush by all of them.
Yeah, but there are some, you know, the Birth of Venus, for example.
Botticelli.
Yeah, when you walk by that's the second time I've been there. Once it was many years ago, and I remember the very first time I saw it, there is something about it that grabs you. And now I've not seen the Mona Lisa other than the pictures, you know, so I don't know if I'm standing in front of it, you know, I think you have to be in its presence, if that makes sense, to actually, you know, like how many pictures of David have you seen, but until you're actually standing there looking at the statue, you can't feel it. And I haven't seen the Mona Lisa, so I don't know. Did you feel it when you saw it?
You feel it, but I mean, I also have friends who say it's a disappointment. After all this buildup, you go in and it's, 30 inches by 21?
21 by 30.
So it's on poplar wood. It's a relatively small work of art. There are guards everywhere. It's between two thick bulletproof pieces of glass. You can't get to it. You know, the thing about going to an art gallery, say in Chicago, is that you can get within a few inches of a famous piece of art. You can't get anywhere to the Mona Lisa. And just as long as we're on that subject, before we run out of time, it's been vandalized. Everyone got a timeline of the Mona Lisa, and it's been vandalized a couple of times in the 20th century. It was stolen in 1911 for 2 years, wound up in Italy. But then a rock was thrown at it. Acid was thrown at it. A mug was thrown at it as late as 2009 in the Louvre. It's had some, like all great pieces of art, it's had moments. The Pietà of Michelangelo was damaged by someone with a
hammer.
Alpine hammer in the last years of the 20th century. And so when you get there, they no longer let you get very close, and you're looking literally through bulletproof glass to be able to see it. It's like going to see the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. So the mysteries, we'll just quickly brush through these. Okay. You know, where and when did Leonardo paint it? Who commissioned it? Why did Leonardo keep it? That's the most interesting one. You know, why did he keep it? So he finishes the portrait of the wife of this rich man, newly rich man who commissioned it, and then it winds up in his own collection. So either he never finished it, or the man who bought it didn't like it, or some people believe that Da Vinci gave him one, and that this is actually that deeper, more amazing piece of art that he never finished. But the fact that it's wound up in Da Vinci's personal effects in France when he died is a mystery, because normally when you commission a painting, the person who commissioned it winds up with it. And how did it wind up in the collection of the French King Francois I? Vasari wrote an 800,000-word history of great artists and sculptors in the 1540s and 1550s. He's the first biographical sketch of Leonardo, and he says that it was indeed the person that you mentioned from the catalog copy in Washington, D.C. And this is so interesting. You know, for all these years, there's been this intense controversy. Was it really Lisa? Wasn't it somebody else? Well, this is a contemporary of Leonardo's. This is a manuscript in front of you of Cicero, so Cicero's orations from the ancient world of Rome, and this 1503 contemporary of Leonardo's is talking on the right about this painting, and he does identify the subject as Lisa del Giocondo, so that would appear to clear up any mystery about who sat for the portrait. But Serge Bramley, the biographer, says there's not the slightest allusion to this painting or to the man assumed to have commissioned it in any of the artist's writings, not even a preliminary sketch. And so there are just mysteries around it, and mystery often creates attention to art. Just looking at it again as we get closer, I think, did you say there were 500?
There are 500,000 cracks in the wood.
Little teeny
cracks in the wood.
So here it is. Here's closer. Here's the smile. And art historians say that you should do this. You should cut the painting off and look at the smile. The smile without the eyes is a different smile than the smile with the eyes. And here are the eyes.
And you can see the veil there.
There's the veil. Yeah. And the veil, you see it coming off on the left side there. But if you didn't have the smile, so what do you think about that? That it's the smile that makes this the world's most interesting painting. What do you make of that?
I don't know.
Nothing. Okay, good. There's the smile. Huh? And look at all those cracks.
Yeah. The hands.
The anatomically correct hands. You can see the rounded chair rail.
And the folds in the cloth. He was a master at that. I'm not an artist.
He used a smoke darkness and light mattered to him more than previous artists.
Sfumato, something like that.
And now we're beginning to get into parodies, but this is the actual scene from the craggy mountains, the bridge. Okay,
so now we set it up, right?
U.S. of A.
Yeah. So I think it's so interesting. Jackie Kennedy is, what, 31, 32 at the time. Think about that.
Flawless French.
And, pardon me?
She spoke flawless French.
Flawless French. And she goes over, in fact, very famously, I mean, the French just fall in love with her, and very famously, Jack Kennedy at that breakfast.
Farewell breakfast.
He walks out and he says, I'm the guy that's known to have brought Jackie Kennedy to Paris. And the French really love her. Well, at any rate, so she says to Minister Malraux, the Minister of Culture, that she would like to, okay, there we go.
This is in Paris they went to Paris in 61, then Malraux came over in 62 at her invitation, the cultural minister of France, and this conversation ensued, and apparently it was spontaneous. This wasn't, pre-planned. Mrs. Kennedy, you should lend us some of your artworks. I would love to see the Mona Lisa again and show her to Americans, Malraux. I'll see what I can do.
Now, the great part about this story is that, I mean, think about, you've got a painting painted on wood. There's 500,000 cracks in the wood. You've got to watch the temperature. You've got to watch the humidity. There's so many things that you got to watch to maintain it.
Vandalism.
You're concerned about transporting it by airplane, and airplane crashes, by ship, the ship sinks. You've got all this going on. So there are exactly 3 people that are in favor of this: Jackie and Jack Kennedy and Malraux. No one else in the world thinks this is a good idea.
When Malraux announced this at the Louvre, they went nuts.
Yeah.
We're not doing it because A, we might not ever get it back. B, we might not get it back intact. What if it's lost at sea? They put it in a special packing case
that would float.
And then they bought a first-class cabin in a French passenger liner, and they strapped it into that cabin, but it was in a packing case that was watertight and would float for 50 hours after the ship sank.
Yeah.
They cared more about the painting than the people on the ship.
Yeah.
And then when it got to the United States, it was met by the Secret Service. Jack Kennedy assigned one of his favorite Secret Service men to guard it all the way to Washington, D.C. I was amused in reading it over again this week, Larry, because, of course, it had to go from New York City to Washington, D.C. over famous bridges and tunnels, which they shut. It was like Chris Christie. They shut
Chris
the
Christie,
tunnels
they shut it down.
to allow this to happen.
But there was a newspaper guy that was traveling, went all the way to Paris, went on the ship, was on the ship the whole time to New York City, and then the Americans take control of it, and they've got a convoy, and they're going to run this convoy to New York City to Washington, D.C., where she will be delivered to the National Gallery. And he writes, "I have traveled with presidents, kings, and queens. I've never seen anything like it."
They didn't stop once.
Did not stop once.
They
did. They had to fill up for gas.
But they didn't stop at a stop sign or a stoplight. And so they would go from New York to New Jersey. They'd be met by Highway Patrol and escorted to the next state line.
They never stopped for a stop sign all the way.
So then this is the man you're talking about,
There
Edward
it is.
Folliard, to Malraux during that same trip in 1962, picking up on what Mrs. Kennedy had said. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the Mona Lisa could be shown in the National Gallery of the United States? And Malraux, again, beyond his pay grade here, perhaps a loan could be arranged. And listen to this. France feels that these masterpieces belong to mankind, that she has no copyright on them.
Which he did not clear with the...
Once de Gaulle heard about this, he wanted to forbid it. Washington Post, when it finally came, said, "The Mona Lisa, First Lady of the World among paintings, and Jacqueline Kennedy, First Lady of the Nation, came face to face. It was a long-awaited reunion. Both ladies were at their glowing best." A little flattering. There they are. This is the scene. That's next to Mrs. Kennedy, who wore, for the first time in White House history, a strapless dress designed by a French designer. That's with Andre Malraux. That's John Kennedy with Mrs. Malraux, Madame Malraux, and of course the Mona Lisa at the National Gallery. And poor Lyndon.
And Lyndon is...
Did you read this story?
Yeah. He's dressed wrong. It's a great story.
He misread the invitation and he wore a white tie. And
he's the only guy that wear a white tie.
And he was so humiliated.
Yeah. Never again.
When he became president, he outlawed blacktail. There wasn't a single blacktail event.
White tie. Yeah.
White tie blacktail event at his White House because he was poor.
That's a great story. Look at him. It's like I feel like I'm on an inside joke here, but it doesn't look funny the way he's looking at the Mona Lisa.
Just think of it. Let's look at the pictures.
Okay, before we get off this, let's just talk just a little bit about the transition when he becomes president. So here are the Kennedys. They bring Mona Lisa. They have great state dinners at the White House. They have classical music. Who's the cellist?
Pablo Casals.
Casal. He played for Teddy Roosevelt, and he played for Jack Kennedy in the White House.
Robert Frost speaks at the inaugural.
Yeah. So Lyndon Johnson's very first state dinner after becoming president of the United States is in Texas, and they sit on hay bales.
But
what a contrast.
At the beginning of this book on the Mona Lisa in Camelot, the author Davis talks about when Mrs. Kennedy came to the White House, she was aware that the White House had been given 6 paintings by Cézanne.
Yeah.
And only 2 of them were at the White House. So she calls over to John Walker at the National Gallery and says, "Hey, those paintings actually belong to the White House. I want some of them to come over." And he very graciously but reluctantly sends over these extraordinary pictures of Provence by Cézanne, and she hangs them. And then when she has the White House redone, the yellow room upstairs is her favorite room, and she puts these Cézannes there. So flash forward now to the assassination.
Oh, sad story.
After JFK's death, Mrs. Johnson comes over to the White House to have a private tour with Jacqueline Kennedy to kind of get an orientation tour, and they go into this yellow room, which is, it's the closest to Jefferson's White House of any room in the White House, and it's Mrs. Kennedy's favorite, upon which she lavished just unbelievable attention and put these prized Cézannes in it. And she said to Lady Bird, "Do you want to keep these Cézannes? They belong to the White House." And Lady Bird said, and I quote, "Well, they're not done by an American, are they?"
Yeah.
And when Mrs. Kennedy said they were French, Lady Bird said, "We wouldn't be comfortable with foreign paintings in the White House.
But there is another side story to this, too, that I thought was interesting. There was another room in which the Cézannes were, and two of them were hung. And after the president's assassination, she was going to have a private audience with de Gaulle and King Philip, Prince Philip.
During the week of the assassination.
Yeah, and so she actually, think about this, her presence of mind, her husband has been assassinated, she's going to meet with these heads of state. She had the Cézannes taken down and American art put up.
Because she wanted to
emphasize that moment. What a, man. Anyway.
Thinking of those details on an occasion like that. Yeah. Here's what John Kennedy said. We'll play this tape right after this, Dusty, so as soon as I finish here. The life of this painting here before us tonight, this is January 8th, 1963, the National Gallery of the United States. The life of this painting here before us tonight spans the entire life of the New World. We citizens of nations unborn at the time of its creation are among the inheritors and protectors of the ideal which gave it birth. For this painting is not only one of the towering achievements of the skill and vision of art, but its creator embodied the central purpose of our civilization. Amazing, huh?
It is.
So, Dusty, could you show this tape? What you're going to see here is Andre Malraux speaking. There was it fell apart. The sound system didn't work, and people didn't pay attention, and John Kennedy actually got angry at the crowd because they weren't paying attention. Go ahead. Secretary of State Dean Rusk.
His Excellency, the Minister of Cultural Affairs of the Republic of France, Mr. Andre Malraux.
Monsieur le Président, voici donc le plus célèbre tableau du monde.
Vous avez bien voulu, Monsieur le Président, parler d'un fait historique, pensant peut-être aux sentiments dont il témoigne. Il est historique aussi en un autre sens qui vous fait grand honneur. Lorsqu'à mon retour, quelques esprits chagrins me demanderont à la tribune de l'Assemblée française pourquoi avoir prêté Mona Lisa aux États-Unis, je répondrai parce qu'aucune autre nation ne l'aurait reçu comme vous.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. Minister, Madame, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to repeat Mr. Malraux's last words, which paid, I think, our country a singular compliment. He said, there has been talk of the risks this painting took by leaving the Louvre. They are real, though exaggerated. But the risk taken by the boys who landed one day at Arromanches, to say nothing of those who preceded them 25 years before, were much more certain. To the humblest among them who may be listening to me now, I want to say, without raising my voice, that the masterpiece to which you are paying historic homage this evening, Mr. President, is a painting which he has saved. Mr. Minister, we're grateful to you.
So think what he's saying here. Andre Malraux is the top cultural minister of the Republic of France, a country that regards itself as dramatically more civilized than the United States. At this time, France believed it was the protector of Western civilization. And de Gaulle and most French looked on Americans the way Lyndon Johnson seemed on those hay bales. He says in this speech, and Kennedy was so upset that the crowd wasn't listening that he then decided to repeat it in English, but he said, Malraux said, yeah, we took some risks to bring the Mona Lisa to the United States, but they pale compared to the risks of your young men who came over to liberate France from the Nazi dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, or the Americans who came over in World War I to liberate France from the Hun of that era. And he said, every young person who did that is the savior of this painting. Mm-hmm. Pretty gracious thing to say.
That is.
I mean, it's amazing that Malraux would say that on this occasion, that America saved the Mona Lisa and everything that the Mona Lisa represents in World Wars I and II. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. Do you have anything here about during World War II, what they did with the Mona Lisa?
No.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Well, we should just talk, just as long as we've brought that up now, that it was actually spirited away from the Louvre and taken to two different locations. I don't remember the names of them, but one of them was a monastery, and
right.
there was another. But at any rate, it was. This to me is really interesting. So it's secreted away the entire time that the Nazis are there until the liberation of France.
Because A, it could be destroyed, and B, it could be looted.
Right, and the Nazis were not above the looting
right.
piece to it, more than anything. In fact, Adolf Hitler wanted to create a museum of art near his home, his childhood home. And so Hitler would have loved to have something like the Mona Lisa there, no doubt about it. Here's what I find interesting in this. There is right now a movie coming out called The Monument Men. And I've seen the trailer for it. I'm going to see it. There are two individuals in this story that were both real monument men that are tied to the Mona Lisa coming to the United States. Their job, after the invasion of France, their job was to try to recover the world's art that the Nazis had spirited away and taken into Germany and all that sort of stuff. So it's going to be a fascinating movie, I know that. But one is, one of the gentlemen that worked for Walker was a guy by the name of Cotter, I think. And he's the one that inspected the Mona Lisa when it arrived at the National Gallery. And when so he's the one individual that actually gets to take the painting, lay it on a table and look at it and inspect it and report on how it survived the transatlantic journey. He was, in fact, a monument man.
Helped to secure them after the war.
Helped secure the art after the war. And then the director of the museum in New York City was a monument man as well. And so then he accepts the Mona Lisa from Walker when it's brought back up to New York City. I just find that fascinating.
These veterans who had been
part of this.
The veterans
that were part of this.
Yeah. Amazing story. So here's what this author says of John Kennedy. She says that Kennedy really used the Mona Lisa as sort of a Cold War token in this speech on January 8, 1963. But his closing would become the single most quoted line by the world press. This is Kennedy now. Politics and art, the life of action and the life of thought, the world of events and the world of imagination are one. And she says the Mona Lisa had instantly become America's claim to the guardianship of Western civilization. Here's a picture of Mrs. Kennedy with Malraux. Did you read this story? Yeah. This is Madeleine Urs of the Louvre, who did not want the painting to come here. And she fought it tooth and nail, but finally had no choice. And so she inspected it for days before it was shipped. And then she came over when it arrived and inspected it again and was here throughout. And her job was to make sure that the Yankees did not, in some way or other, mar this great piece of art. And she virtually had a nervous breakdown over this, and so did John Walker. I mean, he actually later said in his memoirs, he did not want to do it.
Right.
This was imposed upon John Walker of the National Gallery. He said this was the worst period of his entire career, because if something had happened to that painting, I mean, think of it. So anyway, she comes over, and they've established these protocols to protect it from vandalism. And there are Marines on either side of the painting in the National Gallery. And there's this rope. And anyone who crosses this rope is going to be hurt. And she forgot this. She's this glorious French woman. She forgets this, and she crossed the rope line. And a Marine took his bayonet and slapped her with it on the side of her cheek, the flat end of it. And then she was astonished. And then another Marine did that clap, what's that called, where you take the flat of your hand and you snap their windpipe? And she went down like a sack of potatoes. And it took an hour for her to come out of it. We've now assaulted the curator of the Mona Lisa. But she then admitted that she had...
She said they were right. They were doing their job.
But they hit her so hard...
That knocked her unconscious.
That she was knocked unconscious by the U.S. Marines.
Yeah.
You would have thought that would be a setback in international relations.
You would think so.
I just find this so funny. I mean, think of it. You would have thought they would have said,
"Excuse me,
please back away from the rope," or "Parlez-vous français," but instead they took her down. Wow. But she was gracious. She later said, "Women were carrying babies. One of them burst into tears on seeing the Mona Lisa, to my amazement. I thought that our campaign had been well done, since the visitors were clearly emotional and thrilled. For them, it was like meeting the effigy." You have to remember, this is the Cold War. And then he said, the risks, we've had that. Here's it arriving in New York in the special van. And here's the line.
Yep.
2 million, almost 2 million people saw it in the United States in those 7 weeks. And then John Walker at the exit, at the end of it, undoubtedly relieved, said of the American people, they wanted to see it because they knew it was a peak of artistic achievement, the summit of human creativity, and they wanted their children to see it for the same reason. Perhaps afterwards they felt they shared a little in Leonardo's genius. And he said afterwards, this changed the nature of art exhibits. It was the first blockbuster art exhibit. It created a whole genre, remember King Tutankhamun and so on. And it also upped museum visitation at the National Gallery and all of America's great art galleries for years afterwards. It was sort of a lift up that has never ended.
And one of the things Walker said, and you mentioned that at the Louvre, people just want to get to the Mona Lisa. And one of the things Walker said is these people were all lined up outside to come see the Mona Lisa. But he said, then I found them wandering in other galleries. And so it really did have that effect to get people interested in the art.
It did. And he said, since the Mona Lisa has left, our attendance has been unusually high. This famous portrait stirred some impulse towards beauty in thousands of human beings who had never felt that impulse before. More than 2 million people, Kennedy wrote to de Gaulle, and then he said at Amherst, this speech that he gave just before his death in 1963, he gave a speech at the inauguration of a Robert Frost museum at Amherst. And he said, if art is to nourish the roots of our culture, society must set the artist free to follow his vision wherever it takes him. We must never forget that art is not a form of propaganda. It is a form of truth. And he said, I look forward to an America which will reward achievements in the arts as we reward achievements in business or statecraft. I look forward to an America which will steadily raise the standards of artistic accomplishment and which will steadily enlarge cultural opportunities for all of our citizens. Great speech.
It is a great speech.
And he wanted
in
to create
October of 1963.
Just a few weeks before his death, he wanted to create an American minister of culture like Andre Malraux. It didn't happen because of his death, but instead Lyndon Johnson created the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities in 1965, directly influenced by Kennedy's call for a national emphasis on high culture.
And what year did you receive their national award?
So let's move on.
No, it's true.
It's true.
Plays received the...
So let's move on. All right, so now, look. Okay. This is the Mona Lisa today, okay? This is how you see it. There it is. And so I said before, it's the most parodied of all works of art, and I'll just show you a few. I find them amazing. Go on Google Image if you want to see this. There are literally thousands of them, but here's some serious artists. Here's Andy Warhol.
He said 30 is better than 1.
And this was Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp, who put goatee on the Mona Lisa in 1919. The Midwest. Huh?
Oh,
Princess Leia.
Star Wars.
Johnny Depp. If she were an American. I love this.
Oh my goodness.
That's my favorite.
Okay, now I'm just going to tell you what a liar Clay is. He said there's a lot of parodies, and I said, you did not put my face on one of these. Oh, no. Yeah, yeah, right.
I think that's a new hair look for you, Larry.
Let's move on. Moving on.
I think that's quite beautiful.
Keep moving.
Yeah, here she's Southern California. Madonna.
Madonna, yeah.
Billboard in L.A. Well-placed trees. As a pilot. Vin Diesel.
This is awful.
Oh, they're great. Paris Hilton and I don't know who that is.
Marge.
Marge. Conehead.
Coneheads.
Ben Laden. I mean, think of what's happened to the Mona Lisa,
Yeah.
this iconic work of art. Here she is in the 90s. Star Trek.
Miss Piggy.
Miss Piggy. Alien. UFO in the background. See that? In the manner of Picasso, not Picasso. Gary Larson from his Far Side cartoons. Lucy. And Monica Lewinsky,
Oh my goodness.
the cover of the New Yorker. I had forgotten this, but there she was on the cover of the New Yorker. Beyonce? I've forgotten her name, Roger Rabbit. Then they get a little dicey for public consumption. I'll just leave this to your imagination. Megan Fox. But there's a whole, it goes all the way to the other end of the spectrum from there. But my all-time favorite, I think, is Monica Lewinsky.
Yeah.
Because somebody really spent some time on that one. But it is so widely parodied that you can instantly create an advertisement, a cultural icon, an exhibit based upon universal instantaneous recognition of this painting.
Does that depreciate the value of the painting? And by value, I'm not talking about dollar value. I'm talking about the value to our culture. Or does it increase the value to our culture that we can do this?
You know, I think that it's a good sign that we can take high culture and appreciate it, if you look at it on these flanking walls, and appreciate it for its magnificence, and at the same time be irreverent towards it. It doesn't bother me a bit. You know, for example, Stonehenge is widely parodied in the United States with automobiles in Nebraska and so on. I don't see anything intrinsically wrong with that sort of irreverence, do you?
No, I don't. I was asking you.
No, I mean, some of this obviously more than others. If you keep going in Google Images, it gets a little racy.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I mean, some of them are, I mean, like that. That's a pretty amazing little piece of cartoon art. And I don't know about Ben Laden.
Okay,
find
you
it
know,
interesting.
we're about at the
We should take a few
time,
questions.
So we should probably take some questions. Let's finish this up, however, by saying that I think that in some ways the American visit broke the ice for the French. because they ended up sending the Mona Lisa then
To Tokyo.
to Tokyo and to Russia.
And to Moscow, for 11 days in Moscow and for about the 7 weeks in Tokyo.
Yeah.
To Tokyo in 1974, it went in an airplane for the first time. When it was first brought here in 1963, the French thought an airplane was a potentially unreliable way to send it. But then they realized that you're trading 7 or 8 days at sea to an airplane, and they chose an airplane for Tokyo. But it's never been anywhere since.
Right. We didn't talk, we probably should, because it did get back to Italy once in 1911.
When it was stolen by an Italian.
There was an Italian that worked at the Louvre, and he secreted himself in one of the restrooms or a closet overnight, and then when everybody else was gone, then he went and he took the painting, and he lived just a few blocks away, and he actually put it in a cupboard and left it there for a little over a year, and there was all sorts of news stories about where it was at and so on and so forth. And then he took it to Florence, and he contacted the officials of the Uffizi there, the famous museum in Florence, and asked them if they wanted the Mona Lisa. He had it. So they met with him, and then they confirmed, in fact, that it was the Mona Lisa. And here they were in Florence, and
back where it belonged.
Back where it belonged, and you know, in some ways, he was sort of an Italian nationalist. He was getting this Italian painting back to Italy. So then they told him, well, okay, we confirmed, go ahead and go back to your hotel, and we'll contact you. And they notified the police right away, and the police came to the hotel, they arrested him. And then the negotiations started between France and Italy in 1913 as to the return of the Mona Lisa to France. And they worked out a deal where the king of Italy got to show it in Rome for a short period of time, and then it was taken back to France.
Well, what I love about this story, so for 2 years it's gone, and when it was gone, it was presumed to be gone forever. I mean, that no one knew that it would be recovered. And there were lots of rumors about where it might be, and none of them panned out, and so there was kind of worldwide despair about the loss of the Mona Lisa. Would it ever surface again? He had it in this closet for much of this time. He was an Italian national by the name of Vincenzo Peruggia. When he finally took it to Florence, he was, of course, arrested, but he became a national hero. And at his trial, there were riots on his behalf because he was restoring the Mona Lisa to where it belonged in Florence, and he got a very light sentence, a kind of slap on the wrist. And before it went back to the Louvre, they showed it at the Uffizi in Florence, and there were 30,000 visitors to see it on the first day. And so the Italians regarded this as sort of a moment of their national culture themselves, and they were not so upset with this petty thief.
Okay.
That's it?
That's it. Why don't we go to a real picture here?
Back to her.
Yeah, you got a real one.
We'll take a few questions if people have them.
Okay. So we've got a microphone here, and excuse me, even though we're a small, intimate group here, for the taping, they need to have you on a microphone. So
if there are any questions.
If there are any questions, a question right down
here's
in
one
front
down here,
Lori.
My question would be regarding the movement of Mona Lisa at the beginning of World War II. What else was moved from the Louvre to protect? That wasn't the only painting.
Oh, many, many. In fact, I saw a picture, if I can find it, I'll show it to you, of all of the frames. They took the paintings and left the frames. And there's a picture of just one room, and there's just stacks of frames. So the French worked very hard to get a lot of the art out.
Well, who was the Minister of Air in Nazi Germany? Goering.
Goering.
And he was an art collector. And he told Hitler that when the war was won, they were going to take the best art from Italy, from France, and from England, and the rest of the world, and bring it to to Germany, and it would be displayed there. And Hitler would take the parts that he liked to Linz in Austria, in his hometown, to create the world's most important gallery in Austria. And so they announced quite clearly that they were going to loot the world's art, not leave it in place. Right. And so not everything in the Louvre was removed, but the things of highest value were removed, partly because they were frightened at one point that there would be air raids, which there were only a handful of, but then they were frightened that the Nazis would take these things and they would never return. Yep. Other questions or thoughts? Shyla has one, and here's another one.
My neighbor's father was in the legislature at the time that this painting was brought over to America, and at that time they gave everybody in the Senate and in the House of Representatives a picture, copy, as a keepsake. So there's a lot of people somewhere that have got a picture of that commemorative day.
Wow. You know, there were, at the opening, and that was that little clip that we showed, at the opening that night, there were 2,000 people in the gallery that had been invited to that presentation.
The entire Congress, the Supreme Court, the governors, I mean, it was huge. And professors from the greatest universities, and the presidents and professors from the greatest universities in the country. And it was there were so many people that the gallery couldn't really contain them, and the acoustics were terrible, and the amplification system broke down. And so there was really a lot of chaos. And John Walker was humiliated and felt that he had let the Kennedy administration down and offered to resign. And you didn't see it in this very, very grainy black and white, but when John Kennedy stood up, he began to give his talk. So first of all, he repeated what Malraux had said, mostly because he was angry that the crowd had not listened to Malraux. Malraux spoke in French, and then it was translated into English by somebody else. And then Kennedy stood up and said, I'm going to repeat this one more time. And he says it, and then when he went into his remarks, the sound system broke down altogether. And so he shouted the rest of his speech. And John Walker was so humiliated that this had been, that he thought that the French would never forgive us. And the reviews in American and European newspapers were uniformly bad, that we had failed to bring elegance to this moment by having too many people in the wrong place with an inadequate crowd control system. So it was not the great moment on January 8th that the Kennedys had hoped that it would be. Just thought here, maybe.
You got another question over here.
Mike is coming. Oh, wait, I got to wait for the microphone. I'm sorry.
I found the parodies interesting and wondered if that was a typical American thing or if there are a lot of parodies in other countries of the Mona Lisa.
Boy, when I've been to France and to Rome, there are parodies of everything now. I think that kind of
I don't think it's American at all.
I think we specialize in it.
Well, Picasso did, Dali did a parody.
Dali,
you know, so there's some very famous
Warhol,
non-American artists that have done parodies as well.
Now, we're out of time, but no one has asked, Larry, but, you know, there was such a hype a couple of years ago surrounding the Da Vinci Code, the Dan Brown book. And the question was, and I should have brought a close-up, but the question was, if you look at the painting, just to the left, from our view, to the right from the view of Christ, that's John, the beloved disciple. And the question then was, is this truly John, or is this Mary Magdalene, or at least is it a woman? And the whole novel turns on questions of this sort, and a movie with Tom Hanks came out of it. But the people who write about this, biographers of Da Vinci, Donald Sassoon, Margaret Davis, say that it's not a woman. We can't know for sure, of course, but that it is John, the beloved disciple. Da Vinci was in a tradition of Last Suppers. There had been thousands of Last Suppers before Da Vinci, and there have been many Last Suppers after Da Vinci, but all Last Suppers after Da Vinci are influenced by Da Vinci, and his was unique. For one thing, and it seems obvious the minute you hear it, but he brought all of the apostles to the other side of the table. Before that, in paintings of the Last Supper, the apostles were sitting around a table as you would at a dinner party, some of them with their backs to the viewer, and Da Vinci decided to put them all on the opposite side of the table with Christ, And he has 3 groups, or 4 groups of 3. So if you go from left to right, you have 3 apostles. Then you have the group of 3, including Peter and the beloved apostle John, then Christ at the center, geometrically at the center, and just above his head, the vanishing point in the perspective of the painting. And then 3 apostles to his left, and then 3 on the far left. So 4 geometrically identical, essentially, groups of 3, with Jesus isolated in the middle. And in typical Last Suppers up until this point, these icons, the iconography of these things is very ancient. And in a typical Last Supper, the beloved disciple John is asleep on the breast of Christ. He's fallen asleep, and Christ is, in a certain sense, snuggling with him or cradling him against his breast. And Da Vinci decided to break with that tradition because he wanted to isolate Jesus in the center of the painting. But the art historians that work on this say that in this period of the Italian Renaissance, gender was more fluid than it is today, and that there was a cult of the hermaphrodite, or the person with male and female characteristics, and that it was seen not as male versus female, but that people like Da Vinci were trying to incorporate into certain figures of human beauty female attributes and male attributes, and that this was not unusual, and that this certainly wasn't a woman, that this was just a way of portraying a beautiful young man before adult coarseness came to his features. And so the art historians are pretty scathing about the Dan Brown thesis.
No. Now, to make your point there, you've got a picture of John the Baptist here. Where's that?
Yeah, it's farther down. Here, by the way, just before we go, this is this 17th century, considered the most faithful imitation of the painting by another painter. And here you see the disciples in greater detail. But let's go to the painting of the St. John. It's the last of the paintings in this list.
There.
Again, hermaphroditic features, androgynous, we would say today, but partly female, partly male. This is almost certainly based upon his own apprentice, Salai, S-A-L-A-I, a young man who was much younger than Da Vinci and who stayed with him for 30 years, and they may have been lovers, but he was frequently the model for both female and male young people. So,
any other questions?
So as to what people should read, Larry, if you want to read about Mona Lisa and Camelot, this book by Margaret Leslie Davis is an outstanding book. You've got a copy, and yours was printed on demand, wasn't it? This is a print on demand.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah. But I think just on the topic of Mona Lisa coming to the United States, this is the best book.
But this
Mona
one
Lisa and Camelot, Margaret Leslie Davis.
And Donald Sassoon's book, Leonardo and the Mona Lisa Story, is really about the influence of the Mona Lisa since its creation and how it's affected art, the way that art is displayed in museums, the way that art is marketed, the blockbuster exhibit, art traveling, the globalization of art, particularly the radical globalization of art in the age of the internet. It's a fascinating account of what the Mona Lisa has come to represent in world artistic iconography. And then he has another book called Becoming Mona Lisa, which is more about the process by which this painting, which is just a Renaissance painting after all, worked its way slowly through time to become the most famous painting on earth.
And you know, we never did broach the topic that you and I had been talking about a few weeks ago when we...
Which was that?
You know, so today we've talked about Mona Lisa and we've talked about The Last Supper and why those are the 2 most famous paintings in the world, coming from the very same person.
Who was not primarily a painter.
Painter, yeah. I don't know if we got an answer to that one. Maybe we'll do that next year.
Because, well, that's what we were trying to sort of tease out a little earlier in the conversation, that maybe he was on to something very deep in human aesthetic sensibilities that we can't articulate. Or maybe It just happened because the Mona Lisa was not a famous painting until the 19th century. You know, it really became a famous painting when the I don't want to go into great detail because it would take too long, but during the Renaissance itself, there was a high emphasis on classical, Greek and Roman, and hearkening back over what were regarded as the dark or Middle Ages to these pure forms of statuary and painting and buildings and design and literature of the ancient world. But then so the Renaissance lasts from 1380 until, say, 1600. It's followed by the age of science and the age of reason and the Enlightenment. And as time moved on, there was less emphasis on the classical world and more emphasis on the Renaissance. And when the emphasis came on the Renaissance in the 19th century, particularly in Britain, there was a whole new move to pay greater attention to these Renaissance artists, not for their window on the classics, but intrinsically. And that's when Da Vinci's notebooks were discovered and he became the world's most famous genius. But all this time, he had been regarded as sort of second rank to people like Raphael and Titian until the 19th century. And so the Mona Lisa has not always been that painting. It became that painting, and Donald Sassoon has a brilliant chapter on that. But whether we are responding to it because we are Pavlovian and are told that we want to see the Mona Lisa and love it, or whether when we see it, we're actually in tune with something so great that we can't even describe it, is a question that we're not going to be able to answer, and we're not art historians.
Yeah, we're not going to get it there. Okay, so March 30th, we're going to be right back here.
Skull in hand.
Yeah, for the love of Hamlet. And I know that if you showed up on a bad day like today, we'll probably see you on March 30th, because it's going to be beautiful then.
Or never again.
So thank you very much, everybody.